She Thinks, a podcast where you're allowed to think for yourself. I'm your host, Beverly Hallberg, and on today's episode, I'm excited that we have constitutional lawyer Erin Hawley on the program. She's going to talk about a variety of things, starting first of all with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in 2017. She's going to let us know what the benefits were and also some of the misperceptions out there. And she's also going to talk about where things are with the legal battle over the Affordable Care Act and rounding it out with her perspective on how Justice Kavanaugh is doing so far. And also, since she was a clerk for the Supreme Court, Justice John Roberts, she's going to talk a little bit about just how the justices get along. So I'm really excited to hear her thoughts on that. A little bit about Erin. She is also the Associate Professor of Law at the University of Missouri. She teaches constitutional litigation, federal income tax, tax policy, and agricultural law. As I mentioned, she clerked for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and she's a legal fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. But probably most interesting is that her husband just became Missouri's newest U.S. Senator. So we're excited to talk about her husband, Josh Hawley, as well. So, Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Beverly. I'm glad to be here.
And the first question I have for you in your bio, we just learned that you are also married to a new senator, Senator Josh Hawley, and that you have moved from Missouri to Washington, D.C. So I've been in D.C. now for, I'm going to age myself, about 19 years. It took a couple years to get used to D.C., but how has the transition been for you so far?
You know, it's been great. I think we were aided in part by the fact that Josh and I had both lived and worked in D.C. Prior to this most recent move. So that was helpful. We still have many friends from church and a good community that we were able to move back to. But as many of your listeners know, it is completely different moving and living in D.C. with children. So we're actually out a little bit in Vienna, Virginia. I insisted on having a yard for our boys and those sorts of things. So it's been a good move. And the boys, as so many people say, kids are very resilient, and the transition has just gone really beautifully for them, for which I'm really grateful.
Out of curiosity, any food that you're missing in Missouri? How has the food scene been in D.C. so far?
The food scene in D.C. is great, although barbecue.
That's what I figured.
Kansas City barbecue standards, yes.
Well, I was looking forward to this interview with you for a variety of reasons. One was that I really wanted to get your take on tax policy, especially since tax day was not too long ago. April 15th wasn't that long ago. And really get your take on how people as a whole have felt since then. So especially with your experience in federal income tax issues and tax policy. First of all, how do you think in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed? How do you think that benefited the average person getting into tax season?
Oh, my goodness. Well, we saw the benefits concretely in two major ways pretty immediately. And one of those was in tax refunds. So the season was not far off to file the 2017 tax returns. And many individuals received a much larger tax refunds than they had anticipated because of the reduction in rates. I think the average was something around $2,200, if I have that correct. And so that was that tax break was money directly into consumers' pockets. They could use to pay down debt. They could use to invest. They could use to save. They could use for their school, their children's schooling or school supplies, those sorts of things. So a very concrete difference in the lives of ordinary people. And as many of us have heard, some of the Democrats refer to this kind of money as scraps or not much in the way of refunds, but to the average American family, I think that difference was felt immediately and was very helpful. And the second way in which the tax cuts took effect and helped people in concrete ways was many companies who had received a lower rate on their own company taxes returned some of that in an investment to their employees. Many companies issued bonuses at the end of the year, quite large in some cases. And again, these bonuses went to individual workers to support their own families and directly benefited those families as well as the economy.
I was reading one of your pieces that you put on the IWF blog called the Two Truths and a Lie Tax Day. And I thought it was a great article because you played off the game where you put out 3 statements and you had to guess which one was false. And I think there's so much confusion about people thinking that a tax refund means that the government is giving them money. It's not government giving them money. It's their own. They basically gave a free loan to the government. Mm-hmm. Do you see that that's a
Absolutely.
big misperception? And how did tax refunds play out, especially since many of the tax cuts, the money was already put back into people's pay stubs each pay cycle? Do you think people really saw the difference on tax day?
So they did, although they may not have known it. So the interesting
That's what I was
wondering. Yes, between 2017 and 2018 was the timing of the law. So by the time the Tax Cuts Jobs Act had passed, people had already contributed their taxes through withholdings. So the federal government takes a big chunk of money out of everyone's paycheck every month, not only for Social Security and FICA and those sorts of things, but also withholding in anticipation of the income tax. So that's taken out of every paycheck all year long, and those rates are calculated based on the expected tax rate. So that's why we saw such large refunds, larger than people expected for the 2017 year. Now we fast forward, and in the 2018 year, the IRS had recalculated those tables, so it was taking less money out of everyone's paycheck every month. And as you mentioned, this is a tremendous benefit to taxpayers. They have more money at the end of every month that they can use to pay their bills, to save at college, all sorts of those things, rather than giving that money to the government and then hoping they'll get it back when they file their taxes later. So all things being equal, you would much prefer a smaller tax return because that means you've tax refund rather, because that means you've loaned the government less money during the year, and you've instead had that money to use for your own family's expenses.
Now, a common narrative we hear, not just in some news outlets, but also from some of the Democrat nominees who are trying to run for the nomination of the Democrat Party to then hopefully defeat Donald Trump. That's what all the Democrats are trying for. One of the things that we hear over and over again was that the tax cuts and job acts of 2017 was just a pay cut for the wealthy. So obviously what you're saying, what you're telling us, and I think what people saw just in their paychecks every month, that's not the case. But why is this a narrative that they can continue to perpetuate? Why does it seem to have to hold truth and hold so much weight?
I think it really is something that the Democrats and the media sort of portray, that it was just for the wealthy. But if you talk to everyday Americans, they saw more in each paycheck every month. And that doesn't mean that maybe there's not more to do with tax policy, but there's no way that you can look at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and say it didn't benefit everyday working Americans. They each received more in their paycheck every month than they would have without the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And maybe the wealthy may have benefited more in terms of actual dollars, but that's because of the amount that the wealthy are paying initially in those taxes. So it was a big benefit to everyday working Americans as well.
And something, Elizabeth Warren comes to mind. She's someone who is pushing a wealth tax to tax the very wealthy, as she would put it, charge them, I guess, 2% more in tax. When you hear about these taxes that are going to impact the wealthy, how does that impact everyday people? I think on the surface, it sounds to many people like, well, that seems like a good idea. 2% isn't that much, even though they're already paying taxes in other areas. What ends up happening sometimes when the wealthiest in our country do get taxed too much? How does that then flow over into American workers?
Well, I think another good example we can look at is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and what happened to the employees of companies that received some of the lower taxes. And those companies were able to invest in infrastructure. They were able to invest in capital assets. And critically, they were able to invest in their actual employees by giving them unexpected bonuses at the end of the year. So we see from just that one example and paradigm that when a company is doing well, then it can also give more of a salary increases and bonuses and the like to its employees. So a number of the, quote, wealthy, depending on how the plan is structured, might be small businesses. And we want to be careful about taxing small businesses too much because the economic literature shows that much of that tax burden will fall actually on the employees. So we want to be really careful when we talk about taxing the wealthy, especially if we're talking about businesses.
And I want to move to another area that people really care about. Obviously, it's always the economy. Taxes factor into that. But would love to move on to another area that you have worked on legally, and that is the issue of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and wanted to get your take on where things were legally on that. I know that I believe it was the end of last year, you had Texas. There was a lawsuit there. They were challenging the constitutionality of the ACA, and it was a big win for those who don't think that Obamacare is constitutional. But can you break down to us what that case was and where we are today on the legal aspect of it?
Absolutely. Well, that's a very timely question because the case is now up before the Fifth Circuit, who will hear oral argument on the case sometime in early July. And this specific challenge to the Affordable Care Act has to do with, as some of the others did, the individual mandate. And in particular, in the first Obamacare case, the Supreme Court held that the individual mandate was constitutional under the taxing power. And I have to do just a short segue here and mention the basis that the government really argued could support the individual mandate. And what the government said in that case was that because health care is sort of a good that everyone uses, that they could force you to buy insurance under the Commerce Clause. And this was an extremely broad reading of the Commerce Clause. Typically, when you think of the Commerce Clause, you think of Congress regulating something that's already in the stream of commerce. So they can regulate prescription drugs because they're sold over state lines and because there's a market for prescription drugs. But in this case, they were saying we can make you buy a product. We can make you enter the stream of commerce because it's sort of a product that everyone will at some point use. And Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, famously pointed out that using the government's own argument in that case, the Obama administration's argument, that the government could force you to buy broccoli, which just makes no sense out of a limited powers of government. So it's an outrageous sort of argument in that case, and 5 justices found, or 6 justices rather, found that the Commerce Clause would not support that sort of broad reading. However, they found, 5 justices, a narrow majority, found that it could be supported by the taxing power because the individual mandate had a penalty attached to it. Well, fast forward, and a couple of years ago, or this past year, Congress zeroed out the tax penalty. So now that the individual mandate exists and says you shall buy insurance, but there's no tax penalty attached. So a number of states, led by Texas, have filed suit against the lawsuit, saying that there's no tax. Now there's no payment if you don't buy insurance required. So the taxing power no longer applies. So it'll be interesting to see how the court resolves that question. Also interesting to see if the court finds that the mandate is not constitutional under the taxing power because Congress has zeroed it out. What portions of the statute, if some of it they can still keep, if it's in legal terms severable from the rest of the statute or not. And I think the big picture to keep in mind about this case is that any court decision from the Fifth Circuit to the District Court to the Supreme Court shouldn't turn on the merits if the ACA is good or bad policy. None of the ACA decisions that have taken place should turn on whether the law is good or bad policy. Rather, the courts have a duty to interpret the law as written and then to apply the Constitution and say does it or does not fit with the Constitution. So I think we get that misperception, especially from Democrats who, this law is good policy, or Republicans, this law is bad policy. But the question for the court is a much different one. And is this law constitutional? So I hope that they take on that question.
Right. And so let's talk about what are potential outcomes. So obviously a decision can go one of two ways. What could the potential fallout be? What could it mean for Obamacare if it moves in a direction where they say, yes, this tax is unconstitutional, the mandate is unconstitutional, you can't do that? What does that mean then for the law?
That's a good question, and it will depend on sort of the remedy. And the court has two basic alternatives. If they find that the mandate is unconstitutional, then they could just strike that particular provision. Or the district court in Texas found that the mandate was sort of tied up with the inseparable from the rest of the law, that it helped support the rest of the law. And the test is whether Congress would have passed the rest of the ACA without the individual mandate. And the district court said, no, it wouldn't have, So it struck down the entire Affordable Care Act. So that's one possible outcome. I think that outcome is probably less likely. The court would probably sever if it did find the individual mandate unconstitutional. But it could be anything from upholding the individual mandate, maybe on the grounds that the Congress that zeroed out the individual mandate, clearly intended to take the tax away, or it could find that the individual mandate is unconstitutional since there's no longer a tax attached, and just strike the individual mandate, or it could go much more broadly and say because the individual mandate is integral to the entire statute, that the entire statute is unconstitutional and has to be struck down. So there's.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no. So there's a wide variety of outcomes.
So question for you. So I know that you clerk for the Chief Justice, Justice John Roberts. I'm curious, these types of decisions, obviously they're making legal decisions that can have dramatic impact on not just the country, but individual people. When they look at cases that are so big, is it hard for them sometimes to not necessarily know what their perspective is on it, but when they know that there are so many implications, especially if this was a law that Congress put into play and they would rather Congress deal with it, are they very careful about how they word their ruling? Because it does seem that more and more people think that the Supreme Court is part of judicial activism, that so much is being done at the Supreme Court. So does that weigh on their mind?
I think it does. And I think a prime example of that is the first Affordable Care Act case. And in that case, you had the constitutional challenge just to the power of Congress to require individuals to buy insurance that we talked about. And in that case, what the majority did was they actually used sort of a constitutional avoidance canon and said if there's any possible way to save the statute, any sort of way that we can read it, because Congress has said this is not a tax because it's obviously not popular for Congress to add additional taxes. So in passing the ACA, Congress has said not a tax. But then the court looks at it and says, this is a big statute. It's sort of the signature accomplishment of the Obama administration. This is health policy. We're not health policy experts. We're supposed to just be interpreting the law. So I think you see in that case an inclination or a tendency to leave it to the lower branches and to read a statute in a way that was not the most natural in order to sort of push it back to Congress rather than have the courts deal with it. Now, in my view, that was wrong-headed, but I think you definitely see an inclination for the court to be careful in these sorts of cases.
And of course, we're coming into a busy Supreme Court season, so you have a lot of decisions that are going to be made in just a week or two. Some decisions coming down. This is the first big time that we're going to be seeing Judge Kavanaugh, and how I know he's ruled on certain cases so far, but we're going to see with so many cases being decided how he's going to go. How do you feel that Judge Kavanaugh has done so far, and what really would you say his type of legal mind, how he sees cases? What insight can you give on Judge Kavanaugh?
I think Judge Kavanaugh has already made a fabulous Justice Kavanaugh, and for reasons that are already apparent, he's had a few decisions come out, and he's a really careful jurist. So he deals with the facts of a particular case. He applies the law carefully. He's what is called an originalist, so he looks at the original meaning of the Constitution. He's a textualist, which means that the words that Congress wrote matter to him. All of these things are really important in our judges because they're democracy reinforcing, because they allow our elected leaders to govern through statutes rather than a judge who's on the bench and unelected. So I think we see all of these things already in his opinions. I also think it's really kind of remarkable that he actually has already set a record at the Supreme Court, and not for an opinion yet, but rather for his law clerks. So he is the first justice ever to hire 4 female law clerks, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. And for the first time this year, there are more female law clerks than male law clerks at the Supreme Court. And there are typically more female law students than male law students. So it's kind of nice to see it at the court for this year.
I had no idea. That's a really interesting point. So, Erin, since you did clerk for Justice Roberts, I'm curious with you just what you perceived in the relationships of the justices. I was always fascinated by the fact that the late Justice Scalia had a really strong friendship with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And of course, they saw things so differently, but yet they were able to be friends. So I'm just wondering what the demeanor is like among the justices. Do they spend a lot of time together? Do they typically get along? What did you see from your perspective?
Absolutely. Well, I think that friendship between the Justices Scalia and Ginsburg is really emblematic of a friendship that is common at the court. I think one of the best pictures I've ever seen is of Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg riding an elephant together. So they were very much friends outside the court. And this carries over to other justices as well. And it can be sort of an isolating existence, I think, for the justices. They're spend a lot of time by themselves, reading, writing cases, those sorts of things. So they do form close friendships among one another, and not always or even often along ideological lines. Justice Kagan gets along well with Chief Justice Roberts, as well with many other justices. So it is something that crosses over ideological lines. And the justices know that they will be working together for a very long time. So I think that also contributes to the formation of friendships across sort of those ideological lines.
And in wrapping up, I'm curious from you, what are the cases that the Supreme Court's going to be deciding on that you are most excited about hearing what their perspective is on it and their ruling is on it? What should we be looking out for as some of the most important cases?
So I am an administrative law junkie, which is not something that's usually super interesting to some people. This term, the Supreme Court has a chance to consider what's known as the Auer Doctrine. And in that case, the doctrine directs courts to defer to an agency's interpretation of its own regulation. So you've got this sort of double deference going on. Congress passes, as often is the case, a really broad statute, and an agency passes maybe a really broad regulation. And the Chevron Doctrine says that you get deference, that the agency gets deference on that regulation, and the courts have to go with their interpretation as long as it's sort of reasonable or plausible. Well, Auer goes a step further and says that even on an interpretation of the regulation, courts have to defer and to go with any plausible interpretation. You end up with this broad statute, and then you have this application that may have very, very little to do with the statute, and yet the courts, these Article III courts, still have to defer. So I think that case will be potentially very exciting to see what the court does. There's also a monument case up at the court. There's the sort of census question and how the Department of Commerce, their authority over the census. So there's many important cases that will still be coming down. And I think a couple of days ago, Justice Ginsburg sort of indicated that those cases may show some divisions among the courts. So it will certainly be interesting to watch the opinions and outcomes there.
So I know your husband has a legal background as well. Is this like the Super Bowl for you guys to have this time of year when the decisions are coming out?
It is, absolutely. In fact, my sister was visiting a couple of years ago, and we were talking about some case, and she leans over and says, "Is this what you guys actually talk about?" But it is. So we both really love this stuff.
Well, we thank you so much for your time. I know your two boys who are wonderful are with you today, so we appreciate you spending this time. I know you're also very busy with your job and you have so much going on, so thank you for all you do. And thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode of She Thinks, do leave us a rating or a review on iTunes. It really does help, and we'd love it if you would share this episode with your friends so they can know where they can find more She Thinks episodes. So from all of us here at the Independent Women's Forum, thanks for listening.